There is a special time in the life of every man and woman in which they simply slow down, relax, and enjoy whatever experiences they have left. This is known colloquially as the golden years. In the busy hustle and bustle of our everyday world in which men and women work hard to achieve, start, and raise families, they've earned the right to live the rest of their lives at a much less frenetic pace. This was the case of an elderly couple who in one nightmarish fell swoop had their trust stolen and their lives destroyed, and all while they were supposed to be enjoying the benefits of retirement. This is the unsolved murders of Russell and Shirley Dermond. Russell Dermond was always described as a well-rounded kind of guy. He grew up on the rough streets of Hackensack, New Jersey, but was always taught to have an optimistic outlook on life, a hard work ethic, and an appreciation for family. Later on, Russell served in the United States Navy and afterward met his future wife of 68 years, Shirley. Russell would go on to do well for his family, owning several fast food franchise chains throughout the South, but most notably in Atlanta, Georgia. The Dermonds would go on to build a stable and happy home life, and in 1994, they moved into a nearly $1 million estate on the shores of Lake Oconee in the gated community of Reynolds Plantation. However, life for the Dermonds wasn't all roses and sunshine. One of their sons, Mark, would develop a severe drug addiction, something he would struggle with for many years to come. Sadly, Mark would lose this battle as in late fall of the year 2000, he was killed in a botched drug deal. Russell and Shirley did their best to put their lives back together, and as the years rolled on, they settled back into what they considered a normal and quiet life. We fast forward to May 3rd, 2014. A neighbor of the Dermonds notices that Russell and Shirley are on a no-show for a Kentucky Derby party they plan to attend that evening. For 3 days, the elderly couple is unaccounted for, and by May the 6th, friends began to grow concerned. Finally, a few residents of the Reynolds Plantation ventured to the Dermonds' cul-de-sac estate to check on them. Upon first arriving, they noticed that the mail had been piling up, and even more unsettling was that the front door was left slightly ajar. The interior of the house seemed relatively undisturbed, and all the Dermonds' belongings, including cell phone and keys, were left untouched. However, all was not well when neighbors would soon discover as they entered the dark confines of the garage. Lying on the ground in a pool of dried blood was the headless corpse of 88-year-old Russell Dermond. Yet Shirley was nowhere to be found. Even after police are summoned and the entirety of the house as well as the surrounding property was searched, it seemed that Shirley Dermond had vanished. Suspicion began to fall on the 87-year-old wife and mother. However, authorities are confident that she too was a victim, as it was quickly determined that Shirley was physically incapable of committing her husband's murder due to the heavy drag marks that ran across the garage floor. This indicated that Russell was dragged from inside the house and left in between the two vehicles, where he would ultimately be found. Shirley was an elderly gal in faltering health, and this alone seemed to eliminate her as a suspect, but the fact remained that she was still missing. The shocking violence found at the crime scene was unprecedented, as the Dermonds were known to lead a quiet and unassuming life. The couple didn't have any known enemies, and neighbors reported seeing and hearing nothing out of the ordinary in the days leading to the gruesome discovery of Russell's body. Adding to the mystery, the Dermonds were known to be almost religious about locking their doors and arming their home security system, which lends credence to the theory that the crime was committed during broad daylight. However, it seemed almost inconceivable to investigators, as the community in which the Dermonds lived was a safe and tucked-away gated community nestled on the shores of Lake Oconee. In a frustrating turn of events, the surveillance cameras that dotted the community were rendered useless by a freak storm that struck days prior to the Dermonds' attack. On May 16, 10 days after Russell's body was discovered, two fishermen uncover a mutilated cadaver floating 5 miles downstream of Lake Oconee. It is the corpse of Shirley Dermond, dismissing any further doubt that she was somehow responsible for what had happened to her husband. This now presented police with one of the most heinous and baffling double homicides in Georgia state history. Shirley was weighted down with cinder blocks, and coroners determined that she had died from the result of blunt force trauma to the head. They also ascertained that she was killed at about roughly the same time as Russell. The location that Shirley was discovered provided detectives with another theory pertaining to the killer or killers. Police now surmised that the perps gained access to the Dermond's property via the lake and private dock located at the back of the sizable estate. In the following months, the Dermond property was painstakingly combed through, however, no more evidence could be found. Police were determined that if they could somehow find Russell's missing head, it might be the key to cracking the case. Yet here we sit nearly a decade later with little movement in either direction. Leads have been sparse, witnesses few and far between, and suspects almost non-existent. However, the most difficult thing for authorities to understand is why. What could possibly have been the motive to senselessly murder an elderly man and woman who had no known enemies and, by all accounts, bothered no one and just minded their own business? The Dermonds' friends, extended family, and children have all been exclusively ruled out as suspects, and no other persons of interest have been identified. Several theories have been put forward, however, two seem especially credible in the minds of police. The first deals with Mark Dermond and his drug-affiliated murder back in the year 2000. Mark's killer was sentenced to life in prison and remains incarcerated to this day. The drug-related theory has been investigated numerous times, but no solid connections linking the two crimes has ever materialized. A second theory revolves around the murder of another elderly woman named Lois Elizabeth Colley near New York. Lois was also bludgeoned to death in a similar manner as Shirley. More links include Lois making a living off fast food restaurant chains, much the way Russell Dermond had. This theory has also been investigated extensively. Furthermore, a day laborer has pled guilty to Lois's murder and has denied any involvement in the Dermond case. So the questions linger. Who killed Russell and Shirley Dermond? What happened to Russell's missing head? How exactly did the killers gain access to such a safe and tucked away community? And most importantly, the question of why. This is the one word that will forever haunt the Dermond children. It just goes to show you that no one is ever truly safe. But still, you can't help but wonder, who or indeed what could have targeted this particular elderly couple in such a sinister way? You live, you work hard, and you strive to achieve, and all for what? To settle to a nice and quiet way of life only to have the rest of your well-earned time stolen from you by a faceless coward? In life's final act, Russell and Shirley Dermond were dealt a raw hand consisting of a few deuces, a joker, and a card that read, question everything, untrust no one. The relationship between parent and child is often said to be one of the most enduring and tenacious bonds known in the human experience. However, in a few rare cases, this bond takes on far more insidious dimensions. The family ties of love, loyalty, and devotion are replaced with malice, fear, and distrust, as we'll soon see. This is the unsolved case of Charles Rogers and the Icebox murders. Charles Frederick Rogers was born on December 30th, 1921 near the north side of Houston, Texas. His parents were Fred and Edwina Rogers, a middle-class couple who, in and of themselves, were somewhat of an enigma to their surrounding neighborhood. There are many conflicting statements taken from residents over the years. Some have said that they saw Charles coming and going from the family home quite regularly, while others say that they were completely unaware that Fred and Edwina even had a son, as the nature of the family was at best quite reclusive. In 1942, Charles enrolled at Texas A&M, then went on to the University of Houston, where he earned a bachelor's degree in science, studying nuclear physics and motion. During the Second World War, he served with the U.S. Navy as an intel officer. In later years, Charles's profession is more difficult to ascertain. Again, there are conflicting reports that he either worked as a seismologist, a civilian contractor, or even a black ops coordinator with the CIA. But nothing at this point can be definitively corroborated. Conspiracy buffs are adamant that Charles had several clandestine endeavors with the FBI, operating to infiltrate foreign administrations, most notably Soviet counterintelligence. What doesn't seem to be in question was that Charles Rogers was highly intelligent, resourceful, and cunning. It is even said that Charles had intimate knowledge pertaining to the assassination of one John F. Kennedy back in 1963. Yet, despite all the trappings of a highly successful man, many have said that Rogers had a very odd home life. Again, things get muddled with several conflicting accounts. Some people say that despite Charles having several prominent occupations, that for some unknown reason he continued to live with his parents well into his 40s. Yet there are other claims that Fred and Edwina lived with their son and that the house was bought and paid for by Charles. Yet the strange family dynamic didn't end there. Statements have been recorded saying that instead of actually speaking to one another, the members of the Rogers family would pass notes to one another whenever that they wanted to communicate. The reason for this is not known. As mentioned before, some neighbors could never actually remember seeing Charles in or near the house for all the time that the family supposedly lived there. This would all come to a head on the morning of June 23, 1965, when Houston police arrived at the Rogers residence. A concerned nephew of Edwina had phoned authorities to do a welfare check on the elderly couple after he had tried to contact his aunt for several days without result. What police would discover that muggy morning in June would go down as one of the most gruesome and mysterious murders in Texas state history. The house was quiet and inside seemed to be neat and orderly. A short while after searching the house, no signs of Fred, Edwina, or Charles could be found. That is, until officers opened up the fridge. At first glance, nothing seemed amiss, as what looked like butchered hog's meat was neatly stacked on the shelves. That's when two severed human heads were discovered staring up at officers from the clear vegetable bin at the bottom of the refrigerator. Police had found Fred and Edwina, after all. The supposed hog's meat turned out to be both individuals' corpses, horrifically mutilated and chopped into several dismembered pieces scattered throughout the icebox. Apparently, the bodies were completely drained of all blood. The internal organs of both victims would later be found flushed down a nearby sewer. Autopsies indicated that Fred had been bludgeoned to death with a hammer, his eyes gouged out of their sockets. Edwina, on the other hand, was shot in the back of the head, execution style. After this shocking discovery, police initially had concern that Charles may have been a victim as well. However, he was nowhere to be found. A minuscule amount of blood was found leading into Charles's room, but that was later determined to belong to that of his father, Fred. In the ensuing investigation, Charles Rogers would become the prime suspect in the deaths of his parents. The killings were then dubbed by the papers as the Icebox Murders. Despite law enforcement issuing a nationwide manhunt, Charles Rogers hasn't been seen or heard from in almost 60 years. Now the questions spring up. Was Charles guilty on the slayings of his parents, or was he too a victim of an unnamed killer? If he indeed was guilty of the crime, what could motivate a man to such a grisly act? Theories are many and varied in this case, but many allege that Charles had suffered numerous abuses at the hands of his parents, including the theft of his finances, and this is what spurred him on to murder. Other theories center around Charles's clandestine government involvement and claim that Fred and Edwina were killed as a result of them knowing far too much about their son's shady dealings. Still others point to the double homicide as being mafia-related, linked to Fred's days as a recruiting bookie. However, one of the most outlandish ideas says that the Phantom's second shooter that aided Lee Harvey Oswald in the killing of President Kennedy was responsible for the Rogers demise. In an intriguing footnote attached to this case comes from an unsubstantiated FBI informant who claimed that he knew of Charles's whereabouts up to a decade after the double murders had occurred. The supposed informant said that after Charles had killed his parents, he fled to Mexico with the help of his CIA connections. After some years of living in obscurity, he met with his own violent death at the hands of Mexican cartels to whom he owed money, and that his body was buried somewhere near the Yucatan. Nevertheless, Charles Rogers was legally declared dead in 1975 by Houston court officials, halting any further investigations into his disappearance or the murder of his parents. Whatever the truth is, one thing is for certain. We will probably never know the full story of who or what was responsible for the Icebox murders, or what exactly happened to Charles after he vanished in the summer of 1965. Life can throw you some curveballs. But in the case of Fred and Edwina Rogers, it was a game-ending pitch. In the overhead stands, we hear the shrill and ghostly moans that echo, "Question everything, and trust no one." This has been Dark Visions. Pleasant dreams.